Reading the Times for Tuesday, January 14th, 2020. Reading the Times for Tuesday, January 14th, 2020. Iran's grim economy limits its willingness to confront the U.S. For the Iranian government, living in crisis is good. It's always been good because you can blame all the economic problems on sanctions or the foreign threat of war. In the last couple of years, Iran has looked for adventures as a way of diverting attention from economic problems. However, Iran's leaders proceed, experts assume that economic concerns will not be paramount. Iran's leaders prioritize one goal above all others: their own survival. The Islamic Republic does not make decisions based on purely economic outcomes, but Iran's leaders need only survive their own region to recognize the dangers that economic distress. Iran's leaders need only survey their own region to recognize the dangers that economic distress can pose to established powers. Iran previously had a different pathway toward gaining relief from the sanctions. Under a 2015 deal forged by President Barack Obama, the sanctions were removed in exchange for Iran's verified promise to dismantle large sections of its nuclear program. Trump's Iran strategy may cost him in 2020 election. Mr. Bloom, who was raised in a Democratic household in New York and said he voted for Republicans and Democrats in presidential elections, but did not vote for either Mr. Trump or Hillary Clinton in 2016, expressed fatigue with the president's erratic style. A study of military casualty rates at the state and county level found that Mr. Trump won significantly more votes than the 2012 Republican nominee Mitt Romney in places that suffered disproportionately high casualty rates. In the study on military casualties and Trump voters, he and Mr. Shen warned, if Trump wants to win again in 2020, his electoral fate may well rest on the administration's approach to the human costs of war. Some of Mr. Trump's most prominent allies are warning him of the political risks inherent in escalating the conflict with Iran any further. Barr asks Apple to unlock Pensacola killer's phone, setting up clash. If Apple developed a way to allow the American government into its phones, its executives argued, hackers or foreign governments like China would exploit the tool. The company's statement did not say whether Apple engineers would help the government get into the phones themselves. Apple has a notorious history of siding with terrorists over law enforcement. I hope in this case they'll change the course and actually work with the FBI. Apple typically complies with court orders to turn over information on its servers. Russians hack Ukrainian gas company at center of impeachment. With President Trump facing an impeachment trial over his efforts to pressure Ukraine to investigate former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr. and his son Hunter Biden, Russian military hackers have been boring into the Ukrainian gas company at the center of the affair, according to security experts. The experts say the timing and scale of the attacks suggests that the Russians could be searching for potentially embarrassing material on the Bidens, the same kind of information that Mr. Trump wanted from Ukraine when he pressed for an investigation of the Bidens and Burisma, setting off a chain of events that led to his impeachment. The Biden campaign sought to cast the Russian effort to hack Burisma as an indication of Mr. Biden's political strength, and to highlight Mr. Trump's apparent willingness to let foreign powers boost his political fortunes. What happened when a state made food stamps harder to get? The policy seems straightforward, but there is nothing straightforward about the reality of the working poor, a daily life of unreliable transportation, erratic work hours, and capricious living arrangements. The policy change was barely noticeable in the workforce, where evidence of some large influx of new workers is hard to discern. A woman who lives some miles outside of the country said it was nearly impossible to work as a waitress in a town where the last bus comes and goes at 7 p.m. You see people in these hills around here that can't get out to a job because they have no vehicle, said Jerome Comer, 47, who left rehab last year and now is working in the warehouse of facing hunger. Astros manager and GM fired over cheating scandal. The team's heavy focus on analytics earned the nickname Astro Ball, and Mr. Lunau's strategies helped transform the team from a perennial loser to a championship-winning club. In September 2017, all teams were put on notice by MLB after it found that the Red Sox had been sending information about opposing team signs from the replay review room to people in the dugout wearing Apple Watches. As far as the lower-level Astros employees, who were well aware of and participated in the sign stealing, Mr. Manfred wrote that he would defer decisions about punishment to the Astros, and Mr. Crane said the team was still reviewing the matter. Desperate residents ignore dangers of Philippine volcano and return home. Philippine officials appealed on Monday for desperate residents who were evacuated from towns endangered by the erupting Taal volcano not to return to their homes because of the risk. We are asking residents from the government to bring in more soldiers to help us control our residents who ignore warnings and go back home, said Wilson Marlit, the mayor of the town of Balit, which sits on the lake surrounding the volcano. The level 4 alert meant that the volcano was preparing for a hazardous eruption that could spew ash up to 10 miles into the sky, sending thick smoke and ash across the surface of the lake. France agrees to small troop increase, but little else at Sahel Summit. Still, the small boost to the French force was the only concrete result of the meeting, called by a French president increasingly frustrated over calls from protesters in Mali and elsewhere for France to get out of the countries it once ruled as colonies. Its French soldiers, Mr. Macron, who had warned that France might withdraw its troops, wanted the leaders of the Sahel, the semi-arid strip stretching more than 2,000 miles across West and Central Africa, where violent groups loosely affiliated with the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda operate, to make clear in public that they wanted French forces to stay. France's neighbors have shown little appetite for joining a fight that even some French officers say is unwinnable, and that appears to be gaining France few friends, especially in the territories where it is deployed. Will Canadians have to pay the security cost for Harry and Meghan? News from Queen Elizabeth II on Monday that Prince Harry and his wife Meghan will be living part-time in Canada was greeted with a mix of enthusiasm and concern that Canada could end up faced with a hefty bill for hosting them. Now the question will be, who's going to pay the tab for the security bill? One reader commented on the website of the Globe and Mail, Canada's leading national paper, "Welcome to Canada, but I trust you will be paying for any security or other costs. You cannot benefit from your royal station." The sentiment was echoed by other readers. Bill Morneau, Canada's finance minister, told reporters on Monday that the government had not yet decided if it would cover some of the security costs related to the royal move. In statement, Queen supportive of Prince Harry and Meghan's new life. Although we would have preferred them to remain full-time working members of the royal family, the Queen said, we respect and understand their wish to live a more independent life as a family while remaining a valued part of my family. The strikingly personal statement did not answer a host of thorny questions, including who would pay for the couple's upkeep, whether they could achieve financial independence without unacceptably commercializing the monarchy, or even whether they will keep their pay for even whether they will keep their royal titles, given the Queen's pointed use of their first names. The Queen gathered her eldest son and heir, Prince Charles, and his sons, Prince William and Prince Harry to hash out the arrangement, which could set a precedent for future generations of royals in a more streamlined royal family. The Queen went for the celebrity royal family because she thought it would make the family more relevant, said Simon Jenkins, a columnist and former editor of The Times and Evening Standard. Why Dutch officials want you to forget the country of Holland. For decades, the Dutch government used Holland and then the Netherlands interchangeably to describe the country known for its iconic canals, tulip fields, and windmills. Young people, particularly those in countries farther away, are unfamiliar with the country, she said. Historically, the region of Holland has contributed the most to the country's economy and wealth, resulting in its name commonly being used to indicate the entire country. Iran protests rage over down jet as lawmakers demand accountability. Thousands have already been killed or imprisoned by you, and the world is watching. More importantly, the USA is watching. Turn your internet back on and let reporters roam free. Stop the killing of your great Iranian people. In addition to the domestic outrage, Iran may also face demands for compensation from nations whose citizens were killed on the plane. Foreign Minister Vadim Prystaiko of Ukraine told Reuters on Monday in an interview in Singapore. Tensions between the United States and Iran have soared since 2018, when Mr. Trump pulled the United States out of an international agreement limiting Iran's nuclear program and imposed the first in a series of sanctions on Iran to punish it for what the administration sees as a destabilizing activities across the Middle East. After a number of attacks on the United States assets and allies in the Middle East in recent months, Mr. Trump ordered the killing of Major General Qasem Soleimani, the commander of Iran's Quds force. It was like a scene from an action movie. The first of several Iranian missiles to hit the American military base rammed into the airstrip, nearly destroying a guard tower where two young Army specialists were on watch duty. The drone, lost by Sergeant Huey, was one of the few casualties of the missile attack on the base, which was opened by Saddam Hussein in 1987. Finally, the American military detected the missile launches in Iran and determined their likely targets, giving the military personnel in Assad Air Base 15 minutes to take cover. American held in Egypt prison dies after a hunger strike. For years, Mr. Qasem pinned his hopes for release on the hope that American officials could use that aid leverage to obtain his freedom. The following year, days after he was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment, along with 700 other defendants, Mr. Qasem wrote to Mr. Trump to petition him for help. The letter finished, "I am putting my life in your hands." The Working Group on Egypt, a bipartisan group of foreign affairs experts, raised Mr. Qasem's case in a letter to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in June, warning that he was diabetic with a heart condition, who was in imminent danger of death. Ex-judge reveals secrets of how Cuba suppresses dissent. A former high-ranking judge in Cuba has joined an anti-government activist in revealing information from secret government documents that show the government is holding thousands of inmates on dubious charges and has the highest incarceration rate in the world. Mr. Gonzalez said that Cuba's judiciary was often controlled by state security forces that can manufacture cases against political opponents, a statement that critics will readily agree with, but that is surprising coming from a man who insisted that he remains a faithful member of the Communist Party of Cuba and a believer in Fidel Castro's project. People are in prison for stealing flour because they are pizza makers, and the government has set up a system where the only way to get flour is by buying in the black market from someone who stole it from the state. Still, Mr. Gonzalez insisted on Monday there was time for Cuba to resolve its problems internally, and he warned against any outside interference. Rural Venezuela crumbles as President shores up the capital and his power. In order to preserve the quality of life of his most important backers, the country's political and military elites his administration has poured the country's dwindling resources into Caracas and forsaken large swaths of Venezuela. Venezuela is broken as a state, as a country, said Dimitris Pantoulas, a political analyst in Caracas. As runaway inflation rendered the country's currency, the bolivar, practically worthless, dollars, euros, gold, and the currencies of 3 neighboring countries began to circulate in different parts of Venezuela. British police said watch out for extremists, like climate activists. You develop your policing approach accordingly. Ask whether she believed that the Extinction Rebellion was a terrorist organization. The Home Secretary did say, no, they're obviously a protest organization. Extinction Rebellion has held many demonstrations around the world, defying bans on protesting in central London and elsewhere, and annoying countless commuters, business owners, customers, and, yes, police officers. On Monday, a spokeswoman for Ms. Patel said, as the Home Secretary said, Extinction Rebellion is not an extremist group. The police have said that inclusion of Extinction Rebellion in the guidance was an error, and it will be reviewed. The brochure said its goal was to help the public recognize when young people or adults may be vulnerable to extreme or violent ideologies, whether a person is vulnerable to extremism, and if that person should be referred to the government's PREVENT program. The counterterrorism police guide included assorted white power groups, extreme Satanism, and Al-Muhajirun, a proscribed terrorist group seeking the establishment of an Islamic State, and Sharia law in the UK. In addition to Extinction Rebellion, it listed animal rights extremism, warning of people who watch animal liberation videos and who strongly oppose wearing fur, hunting foxes, and eating meat. U.S. says China is no longer a currency manipulator. The Treasury Department released its long-delayed currency report on Monday afternoon, providing its first public analysis of China's currency practices since it designated China a manipulator in August at the direction of Mr. Trump. Unfortunately, President Trump would rather cave to President Xi than stay tough on China. When it comes to the president's stance on China, Americans are getting a lot of show and very little results. The currency report, released on Monday, said China has agreed to publish relevant information related to exchange rates and external balances. China will remain on the Treasury Department's list of countries whose currency practices warrant close attention. While China still has a sizable trade surplus with the United States, its overall current position is near balance, further undercutting the characterization of China as a currency manipulator. Treasury's currency report noted that the renminbi was trading at as high as 7.18 per dollar in early September and was recently trading at 6.93 per dollar. Iowans, famously indecisive, worry the 2020 race is a mess. In interviews at campaign events in recent days, many Iowans were still wavering, often listing several candidates they liked, but also reasons that each candidate could be perceived as weak. Bob Wymore, a retired truck driver from Ottumwa, said after a Sanders event recently that he was still undecided even though there are several candidates he liked, including Mr. Sanders and Miss Warren. The lanes aren't as clear as what I think people thought they would be. Voters sound like cable news pundits as they mull the candidates, wondering aloud if progressives like Mr. Sanders and Miss Warren can carry crucial swing states, and if moderates like Mr. Biden and Mr. Buttigieg would excite the party's young and diverse base. New Iowa poll shows tight race with Joe Biden jumping ahead. Mr. Biden's 3 closest competitors are clumped together in a statistical tie, with Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont earning 18%, former Mayor Pete Buttigieg of South Bend, Indiana, 17%, and Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts earning 15%. The Iowa Democratic electorate remains focused mostly on domestic issues, with 45% calling health care their top concern and another 18% naming either jobs or income inequality, according to the Monmouth poll. Quinnipiac University released a national poll that showed Mr. Biden at the top of the heap with 25% support among Democrat voters nationwide, followed by Mr. Sanders at 19% and Ms. Warren at 16%. Museum director forced out amid harassment complaints. The director, Joshua Helmer, is no longer employed at the Erie Art Museum. The Erie Museum's board said in a statement, the action against the museum director, who had been appointed to the Erie Post in 2018, followed a New York Times article on Friday that reported that multiple women had accused Mr. Helmer of making advances toward them in the workplace while he was at the Philadelphia Museum, and that an intern had made a similar complaint in Erie. On Facebook, the Museum Studies program that University of Delaware called the Philadelphia Museum's response and the Erie Museum's vetting procedures. On Facebook, the Museum Studies program, the University of Delaware called the Philadelphia Museum's response and the Erie Museum's vetting process inadequate. At the Philadelphia Museum, Mr. Helmer was made assistant director for the interpretation in 2014, just 4 months after arriving. Cory Booker's exit from 2020 race ends a once promising political chapter. Our campaign has reached the point where we need more money to scale up and continue building a campaign that can win. Money we don't have, and money that is harder to raise because I won't be on the next debate stage, and because the urgent business of impeachment will rightly be keeping me in Washington, Mr. Booker told supporters on Monday. Nearly all of the remaining Democratic candidates praised the campaign Mr. Booker ran, and on Monday many shared photographs of Mr. Booker offering them a hug or posing for a selfie with a voter. Mr. Biden said Mr. Booker had campaigned with joy and heart. Andrew Yang, who formed a relationship with Mr. Booker on the campaign trail and regularly exchanged text messages with the senator, said he would miss seeing Mr. Booker on the trail. Bernie Sanders says he'd consider releasing list of Supreme Court picks. Senator Bernie Sanders said in an interview that he would consider releasing a list of potential Supreme Court appointees he would name if elected president, and noted that his wife Jane also believes he should offer a roster of jurists in the way President Trump did during his 2016 campaign. Mr. Sanders suggested that it was premature right now to unveil the names of his prospects for the nation's highest courts. Got to kind of win the nomination first, he said, but he warmed to the idea in an interview with the editorial board of the New York Times. The board's interview of Mr. Sanders, which lasted 90 minutes and was conducted last month, touched off a broad range of foreign and domestic issues. Warren says Sanders told her a woman could not win the presidency. One well-respected poll from the Des Moines Register and CNN placed Mr. Sanders and Ms. Warren as the top two candidates in Iowa, with Mr. Sanders leading the pack. Over the weekend, Politico reported on a script distributed to volunteers for the Sanders campaign that suggested telling backers of Ms. Warren to support Mr. Sanders instead. The people who support her are highly educated, more affluent people who are going to show up and vote Democrat no matter what, the script said. Democrats need to unite our party, and that means pulling in all parts of the Democratic coalition. Mr. Sanders said that he has never personally attacked Ms. Warren, and that both campaigns had hundreds of employees who sometimes say things they shouldn't. Late Monday, Representative Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii, another Democratic presidential candidate, wrote on Twitter that she had also met with Mr. Sanders before announcing her bid. Trump plans to divert additional $7.2 billion from military to wall. President Trump plans to divert an additional $7.2 billion in military funding for the construction of a wall on the southern border, according to two people familiar with the plans, as officials rush to show major progress on his signature campaign promise in time for the 2020 election. The money would be stripped from Defense Department construction and counter-drug programs, the official said, and amounts to even more than the billions the administration transferred from the Pentagon last year to pay for Mr. Trump's border wall. Mr. Trump's pursuit of a border wall picked up momentum last Thursday when a federal appeals court allowed the administration to use $3.6 billion in military construction funds, a move that delayed or suspended 127 military projects. Wisconsin election officials held in contempt for refusing to purge voters. A Wisconsin judge held 3 state election commissioners in contempt on Monday and ordered them to proceed immediately with purging more than 200,000 people from the state's voter rolls. Judge Malloy's order, which includes a $250 per day fine for the 3 commissioners who voted against the purge, could set up a dramatic meeting on Tuesday of the Wisconsin Elections Commission. It's no secret that this voter purge would target Wisconsin's communities of color and young voters, the very people who are the most energized to turn out in 2020 and win change for our neighborhoods. Jennifer Berry, a Wisconsin resident who is a leader in the group, pushing for a $15 minimum wage, said in a statement. To the contrary, Trump has tried to weaken protections for pre-existing conditions. The health law established by Consumer Protections for Americans who buy their insurance, including a rule that health insurers must offer coverage to anyone who wishes to buy it, with the prices varying only by region and the age of the customer. The bills would have weakened rules that require insurance to cover a standard set of health benefits, for example, and would have established policies that would have raised prices for people with a history of health problems. Medicare for All, a proposal endorsed by more than 100 Democratic House members and 2 major presidential candidates, would reshape the health system by eliminating private health insurance and replacing it with generous government coverage funded with tax revenues. A narrative collapses as Trump tweets, it doesn't really matter. Trump's tweet came in response to unflattering articles about how Defense Secretary Mark T. Esper appeared to contradict the president's claim that he believed there was an imminent threat on 4 American embassies in the Middle East. The president's stream of Twitter posts targeting her appeared to be an attempt to assail her credibility. The same week, she was expected to send 2 articles of impeachment against Mr. Trump to the Senate. Responding on Twitter, Mr. Schumer asked, "President Trump, how low can you go? Dana Shell Smith, a former United States ambassador to Qatar, wrote on Twitter that Mr. Trump was engaging in hate speech against an entire religion. Mr. Trump's retweet was also not the first time Republicans have tried to link Democrats to the Iranian government through the use of doctored footage. A step-by-step guide to Trump's impeachment trial. The House managers will march from their chamber across the Capitol through the elaborately painted rotunda under the dome to the Senate chamber to deliver a bound copy of the impeachment articles to senators assembled for the occasion. Once the managers arrive, the Senate Sergeant-at-Arms will cry out, "Hear ye, hear ye," and give senators a warning to stay quiet. All persons are commanded to keep silence on pain of imprisonment, while the House of Representatives is exhibiting to the Senate of the United States articles of impeachment against Donald John Trump, President of the United States. One of the managers will then read aloud and in full the House's 2 articles from the well of the Senate before the whole team leaves. Republicans rule out outright dismissal of impeachment charges. In interviews, rank-and-file senators and party officials made clear on Monday that even if they wanted to pursue dismissal, the votes simply were not there to succeed, at least not at the outset of the trial. The resolution failed, and the trial lasted several more weeks before senators ultimately voted to acquit Mr. Clinton on both charges against him. "We're taking an oath to be impartial," he said, "and that, to me, means we have a constitutional duty to hear the case, ask our questions, and decide whether we want additional evidence in terms of documents or witnesses." All 3 senators, plus Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, also said Monday they were pushing Mr. McConnell to allow votes on calling additional witnesses and evidence after opening arguments. The only Mr. Romney stated he would outright support calling witnesses. You call that transparency, Mr. President? A single visit in 2017 by Eric Trump to a Trump property under construction in Uruguay cost taxpayers nearly $100,000 just in hotel bills for Secret Service agents and embassy staff members. So much for candidate Trump's pledge in 2015. He would save taxpayers money because I would rarely leave the White House because there's so much work to be done. Democratic lawmakers, perturbed by the cost of the Trump clan's globetrotting and even more by the administration's lack of transparency, are pushing for an accounting. The fledgling Trump administration, according to an analysis by the Associated Press for 2017, censored, withheld, or said it couldn't find records sought by citizens, journalists, and others more often last year than any point in the past decade. Mr. Trump's claims of historical transparency earned him a pants on fire rating last year from PolitiFact. Lingering questions after the Iran crisis. The United States, my country, unilaterally pulls out of the nuclear agreement between Iran and our allies, an agreement that Iran was honoring. We then proceed to assassinate Major General Qasem Soleimani, the top general of Iran, a sovereign nation. Then our Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, appeared on television to announce new sanctions against Iran to persuade Iran to behave like a normal nation. Not sure what the secretary wants. Trump's plot against healthcare continues. Democrats running for president have spent a lot of time debating so-called Medicare for all, with some supporters of Bernie Sanders claiming that any politician who doesn't demand immediate implementation of single-payer health care is a corporate tool or something. While we debate the ideal health system, we mustn't forget that Trump and his allies are as determined as ever to undo the progress we've made. The people who want to take away your health care haven't given up. Elizabeth Warren is the Democrats' unity candidate. Warren backers, the script said, are highly educated, more affluent people who are going to show up and vote Democrat no matter what, and she's bringing no new bases to the Democratic Party. Attacking another candidate's supporters rather than her record is kind of obnoxious, but as far as political combat goes, it was pretty mild. On Monday, CNN reported that during a private conversation at Warren's apartment in 2018, Sanders told Warren that he didn't think a woman could win the presidency in 2020. Brianna Joy Gray, Sanders' press secretary, dismissed arguments for Warren's broad acceptability. Writing on Twitter, Warren has plenty to recommend her, but nominating the candidate who people don't feel so strongly about one way or another is not how you beat a man as galvanizing as Trump. But the claim that people don't feel strongly about Warren is just wrong. J-Lo was robbed. Latinos were robbed. A nomination for Miss Lopez would have burnished her legacy as an actress more than 25 years after her breakout role in Selena. Even more dispiriting is what Miss Lopez's snub means for Latinx representation more broadly. Miss Lopez was the only Latinx performer with a real shot of recognition in major categories this year, and seemed to shoulder much of the burden of fending off another Oscar so white. Characters that are unambiguously Latinx, but are depicted beyond their cultural identity, are a rarity. In several of Miss Lopez's early roles, she often portrayed women who can arguably be coded as white. A couple of questions arise. If it has taken this long for a household name like Miss Lopez to attain such median, perfectly tailored party, what is the fate of those emerging Latinx voices without such clout? And what does it mean that this type of Latinx character, not a maid, not a drug mule, not a nanny, wasn't acknowledged by the Academy? Miss Lopez will be fine. Her degree of superstardom and ability to produce her own projects should hopefully ensure even more great roles for her. I'm a reporter in Iowa. Here's what my state is looking for. Nationally, Mr. Biden's clearly in the driver's seat, and we keep hearing that he's the most electable. Here in Iowa, the ability to generate excitement is what makes a candidate win or place well on caucus night, not pundit perceptions of electability or poll positions. On caucus night, given the soft support I see, if the weather is bad, Mr. Biden's supporters might not come out. I've walked with Mr. Sanders and his supporters in 4th of July parade and seen Mr. Yang do a call and response of his campaign points to a standing room only crowd at a local brewery. Trump's frightening vision of the presidency is on trial, too. Did Mr. Trump abuse the power of his office in his interactions with Ukraine? And did he obstruct Congress's investigation into the matter? But the real question before the Senate is far broader than the specific scandal recounted in the articles. The Ukraine scandal presents a near-perfect distillation of Mr. Trump's conception of his office, and the House's article of impeachment will put many of the elements of his vision before the Senate for judgment. In the impeachment trial, senators will vote on whether to ratify the propriety of Mr. Trump's behavior, and Republican senators will no doubt seek refuge in the narrowness of the articles and the constitutional technicalities of executive power. Depression and anxiety in a polarized time. The World Health Organization identifies depression as a leading cause of disability worldwide. While many in the mental health field have questioned Mr. Trump's fitness to serve, Mr. Siegel touches on a way in which Mr. Trump poses a danger to our country. He is bad for our mental health. For rabid Trump supporters, it means a loss of conscience and a full embrace of living in a world of made-up facts. How Tiffany moved 114,000 gems without getting robbed. There were 300 cameras monitoring the Tiffany store and about as many in the temporary store, as well as a few more trained on the route along the sidewalk that were live feeding monitors surveilled by other security officials in the two stores and at Tiffany's distribution center in Parsippany, New Jersey. Employees had been told to keep word of the move quiet. In 2018, the rapper A$AP Ferg did a remix of Moon River with actress Ellie Fanning in a nod to Breakfast at Tiffany's. And ever since Tiffany opened the cafe in 2017, it has been possible to do what Holly Golightly did not, have breakfast inside the store. As the writer Joseph Purtell noted in his book, The Tiffany Touch, after several years of losses in the 1930s, for the first time Tiffany's was counting the pennies. He wrote that the only items that disappeared in the move were 3 inexpensive cups and 2 glasses. This time, Tiffany relied on employees who started emptying the display cases about an hour after the store closed at 4 p.m., 2 hours earlier than usual. Jersey City attackers' bomb had range of up to 5 football fields. Officials had previously identified Mr. Anderson and Miss Graham as the leading suspects in the killing of a taxi driver who was found dead in the trunk of a Lincoln Town car in Bayonne on December 7th, officials said. On Monday, officials said that the ballistics test had linked the same .22 caliber handgun used in the highway shooting to the death of the cabbie, who was bludgeoned and shot in the head. The authorities also tied Mr. Anderson and Miss Graham to the taxi driver's killing with other evidence. Officials said one of the 2 notes found in Mr. Anderson's pocket after he and Miss Graham were killed in a standoff with police on December 10th read FBI's War on Black America 3545, a reference to a 1990 documentary in which the Black Panther leader Fred Hampton describes law enforcement officers as fascist pig cops. The second note had the phone number of a Keyport, New Jersey man who was later charged with illegally possessing guns. Why Ocasio-Cortez is criticizing Cuomo's plan for a train to LaGuardia. A crucial part of that $2 billion AirTran, an elevated people mover that would connect LaGuardia to New York City subway system and commuter rail. The proposed 1.5-mile path of the AirTran would take it along the south shore of Flushing Bay and around City Fields and Willets Point, where there are stations for the 7 subway line and the Long Island Railroad. Those stations are further east than LaGuardia, so travelers from Manhattan will have to go beyond the airport to head west, tracing the route of a proposed AirTran to LaGuardia Airport. I need to fix that. Still, the report concluded that none of the alternative routes were feasible, leaving just two choices: build the AirTran or do nothing. Where adults who need a hand gain independence. Miss Sowles found her place to stay for the night, and then she made a proposal. What if Miss Simons moved into a studio apartment? Rose said, "You can have your own space," and I said, "Really?" Miss Simons recalled recently as she sat in her apartment in Brooklyn Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood. For more than a decade, she has lived in one of 12 apartments designed for adults with intellectual disabilities run by Brooklyn Community Services, a beneficiary agency of the New York Times Neediest Cases Fund. For Miss Simons, having her own apartment gave her new freedom, and her neighbors aren't the only ones to benefit from the individualized residential alternatives program, supported last year by $32,600 from the fund. Subway service disrupted after water main breaks on the Upper West Side. The incident disrupted subway service on the number 1, 2, and 3 lines, with no trains running between 42nd Street and 96th Street, according to a Metropolitan Transportation Authority. Naz Shirzad, 47, said he arrived at his coffee and bagel stand on the 62nd Street and saw the water gushing from a fire hydrant and shooting toward a building at the corner of 62nd Street and Broadway. Water service had been disrupted to at least 2 buildings on West 62nd Street, but was restored by afternoon, Mr. Timber said. Subway arrest investigated over claims people of color are targeted. In a letter to Dumas F. Shea, the police commissioner, the officer of the Attorney General, Letitia James, requested enforcement data, policies, and other information that she said may shine a light on whether officers have exhibited racial biases or engaged in discriminatory practices. If groups of New Yorkers have been unfairly targeted because of the color of their skin, my office will not hesitate to take legal action, Ms. James said in a statement accompanying the letter. Devorah Kay, a police spokeswoman, said in response to Ms. James' announcement that the police department's transit officers patrol day and night to keep 6 million daily riders safe and enforce the law fairly and equally without consideration of race or ethnicity. In a television interview on NY1, Mayor Bill de Blasio said he supported Ms. James' inquiry. In the letter sent to Mr. Shea, civil rights investigators from Ms. James' office asked the police department to turn over documents that would provide a complete picture of fair evasion enforcement since October 2017. Bill to end religious exemptions for vaccinations collapses in New Jersey. After weeks of sustained and boisterous protests by vaccine skeptics, as well as last-minute effort to amend the proposed bill to win the support of key lawmakers, the effort collapsed on Monday in the New Jersey State Senate. In its original form, the bill would have included all students enrolled in any school or college, public or private, making it one of the most sweeping among the several states that have voted to end religious exemptions to immunization. The private schools and daycare centers that would have been exempt under the amended version of the bill would have been required to collect and share data on the number of enrolled students who have not been fully immunized. What the rebirth of this old steel center means for Trump. The area includes Northampton County, one of the few counties nationwide, and among only 3 in the state that voted for Barack Obama twice before giving Donald J. Trump a plurality in the 2016. Mr. Trump's message on trade and defending jobs resonated in the Lenai Valley, where there are memories of how foreign competition clobbered the local steel and cement industries. Lots of jobs, but not real good jobs. Many of the jobs available are like the one Mr. Stump left behind. Oyo scales back as SoftBank-funded companies retreat. This month, Oyo also stopped selling rooms in more than 200 small Indian cities, according to the company document, and 1 current employee and 1 former employee. As Oyo's losses have mounted, senior leaders at the company have told employees that SoftBank has demanded that it become profitable on a basis known as EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, and depreciation, and amortization, by mid-2020, according to current and former employees. Prabjit Singh, an Oyo business development manager who left the company in September, said employees who criticized the company ran a greater risk of losing their jobs. The Iowa Reporter in the middle of the 2020 action. The whole presidential process starts right there. The candidates tend to spend the most amount of time there, and the access that particular reporter can have is pretty remarkable, said John McCormick, a Register alumni who covers politics for the Wall Street Journal. At local outlets, the Des Moines Register specifically, it's usually easy to get policy and issues covered in a way that is away from the typical political process angles. The Register's endorsements will receive national coverage when it appears in the coming weeks. Register reporters have gone on to cover politics at national outlets including the Associated Press, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. Budget deficit topped $1 trillion in 2019. The federal budget deficit surpassed $1 trillion in 2019, the Treasury Department reported on Monday, as tax cuts and spending increases continued to force heavy government borrowing amid a record-long economic expansion. Mr. Trump promised to balance the budget and constrain federal spending as a candidate in the 2016 presidential election. And at one point, he said he could pay off the entire federal debt in 8 years. Spending has increased 5.7% per year, and the deficit has grown by 20.8% per year. Grindr and OKCupid spread personal details, study says. Grindr, the world's most popular gay dating app, transmitted user tracking codes and the app's name to more than a dozen companies, essentially tagging individuals with their sexual orientation, according to the report, which was released Tuesday by the Norwegian Consumer Council, a government-funded nonprofit organization in Oslo. To help developers place ads in their apps, ad tech companies may spread users' information to advertisers, personalized marketing services, location data brokers, and ad platforms. In 2018, another Norwegian nonprofit group found that the app had been broadcasting users' HIV status to 2 mobile app service companies. Race and medicine, the harm that comes from mistrust. As part of the 1619 Project, Evelyn Hammonds, a historian of science at Harvard, told Janine Interlandi of the New York Times, "There's never been any period in American history where the health of blacks was equal to that of whites. Disparity is built into the system. African American men, in particular, have the worst health outcome of any major demographic group. The findings are consistent with lots of other work that reveals African Americans' distrust of the healthcare system, the receipt of less care, and worse health outcomes. Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act stipulates that neither race, color, nor national origin may be used as a means of denying the benefits of or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. As nearly every facet of the American health system receives federal financing and support, well-documented and present-day discrimination in healthcare suggests the law has not yet had its intended effect." With demand rising, airlines add flights to India. The contribution of travel and tourism to India's gross domestic product, the broadest measure of goods and services produced in India, is expected to increase to $492.2 billion in 2028 from $234 billion in 2017. The international airlines have also increased the flights in the wake of the collapse of Jet Airways in April 2019, which in 2018 accounted for nearly 20% of passengers flown by Indian Airlines, and the slow decline of the Indian government-owned carrier Air India. While there are signs of an economic slowdown in India, business travel to India remains strong. Welcome to India, Mr. Bezos. Here's an antitrust complaint. In a statement, Amazon said, "We welcome the opportunity to address allegations made about Amazon. We are confident in our compliance and will cooperate fully with the CCI." Flipkart said it was complying with all laws in India governing e-commerce and noted the large number of sellers on its platform. The Federal Trade Commission and the House Judiciary Committee are examining whether Amazon treats unfairly sellers that do not use some of Amazon's services, such as its fulfillment network. The European Union's Antitrust Commission has opened an investigation into whether Amazon misuses information from its marketplace sellers to decide what products it sells directly to customers, including its own private label offerings. And that has been Reading the Times for Tuesday, January 14th, 2020. Reading the Times for Tuesday, January 14th, 2020.